Happy Days Are Here Forever is a work of alternate history fiction set during the Cold War. The following events are based on the Cold War Iron Curtain, a world-divided mod for Hearts of Iron 4. 1960s Part 2, Cubans play baseball, Russians play soccer. While flying over Cuba, an American Navy recon flight noticed a Soviet freighter carrying equipment towards the island, as well as SAM sites in Cuba with patterns near identical to those set up in the USSR's missile facilities. Once the photos were analyzed by the CIA, it was clear that the USSR was building missile launch facilities in Cuba that could reach any American city they targeted. President Kennedy convened the Executive Committee of the National Security Council to determine the best course of action. After intense debate between the Joint Chiefs, the Secretary of State, and the other members of ExComm, it was decided that a naval blockade would be put in place to prevent further missile supplies being transported to Cuba. Soviet General Secretary Nikita Khrushchev attempted to negotiate with the Americans, offering the withdrawal of Soviet missiles from Cuba in exchange for the removal of American missiles in Turkey, just across the Soviet border in the Middle East, and a promise to never invade Cuba. The president's advisors were vehemently opposed to this idea, as it would not only alienate the Turks, but also expose Guantanamo City to a Cuban invasion that the US would not be able to counter. The proposal was rejected by the president, and the crisis continued. As the Soviet ships inched closer to the American blockade, many feared that the world was about to be baptized in nuclear fire. At the very last second, however, the ships turned around and headed home, while Soviet forces in Cuba were ordered to dismantle and remove all launch facilities on the island. The whole ordeal was a massive success for the West and a humiliating defeat for the communists. Fidel Castro was reportedly enraged at the Soviets' abandonment of Cuba. Some claim that he could be heard shouting "Carajo" at the end of every sentence during a meeting with his advisors. In Guantanamo City, crowds gathered near the newly constructed Bay of Pigs monument to celebrate the massive blow to Castro's government. Back in the States, President Kennedy made extensive investments to the economy, such as developing the region of Appalachia, passing the Federal Transit Act, and rolling back the price of steel. Kennedy also managed to lobby moderate Republicans and passed the Equal Pay Act and Clean Air Act in 1962. Tragically, John F. Kennedy, 36th President of the United States of America, was assassinated in Dallas, Texas, on November 22, 1963. The news broke over television, the first time a moment of such national tragedy was reported over said medium, and millions of Americans saw Walter Cronkite of CBS News report on the event.
From Dallas, Texas, the flash, apparently official, President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time, 2 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, some 38 minutes ago. Vice President Lyndon Johnson has left the hospital in Dallas, but we do not know to where he has proceeded. Presumably, he will be taking the oath of office shortly.
1960s Part 3. There's nothing happening here. As racial tensions in the United States continued to increase, civil rights became the word of the day in both houses of the United States Congress. Lyndon B. Johnson, Kennedy's vice president and now president of the United States, was determined to get civil rights passed through the gridlocked Congress before the elections of 1964. Thanks to President Johnson's masterful skills at the art of persuasion, the Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act were passed between the months of January and April of 1964. Several Dixiecrats and Southern politicians were enraged at what they saw as LBJ's steamrolling over the Congress, and it became clear that the political landscape of the South, and indeed the rest of the United States, had been shifted forever. On August 2, 1964, the Gulf of Tonkin incident occurred off the coast of Vietnam. According to the crew of the USS Maddox, they engaged 3 North Vietnamese torpedo boats and managed to repel them with 0 American casualties. 2 days later, the Maddox claimed to sink 2 more North Vietnamese torpedo boats after another engagement, yet there was no physical evidence to support this. Despite calls for war, something about this incident rubbed President Johnson the wrong way, and rather than a full declaration of war against the North Vietnamese and their Viet Cong supporters, he instead opted for limited operations and restricted involvement, at least for the time being. You're telling me some of our best boys can't find the bodies of some deep-fried Vietnamese bastards? This whole thing smells like some dumb son of a bitch got caught with his nuts in the wind, and now he's trying to save face by conjuring up some make-believe pile of horseshit. I'm not about to throw myself in the shitter that is Vietnam based on something our boys can't tell me is real. 1 month later, the United Front for the Liberation of Oppressed Races, or FULRO, rose in open rebellion against both the North and South Vietnamese governments. Neither communist or anti-communist, the FULRO's only concern was the defense of the interests, if not full independence, of the Chari, the Montagnards and the Khmer Krom, all minorities that resided in Vietnam. Before President Johnson could even consider his options, a communist uprising sparked in Portuguese Mozambique. Immediately, the president pledged support for the Portuguese government in their war against the communists in Angola and Mozambique, hoping that the news would draw attention away from Vietnam. 1960s Part 4. Looking Swell, Lyndon. Before anyone knew it, it was election time in America once again. Having displayed his capacity for leadership after the death of John F. Kennedy and his management of the deadlocked Congress, Lyndon B. Johnson won his first term as President of the United States. This term would mostly focus on what he called the Great Society, a collection of socio-economic reforms aimed at destroying racial and economic inequality in the country. One of the more controversial pieces of legislature passed was the Cuban Adjustment Act of 1966, which allowed for the free movement of goods and people from Guantanamo City to and from the mainland United States, as well as creating the legal procedure to grant Cuban refugees the status of permanent residents provided certain requirements are met. The act was not controversial due to the aid of refugees, as most of Congress and the American people were staunchly in favor of helping Cubans who escaped from communism. The controversy stemmed from the free movement of Cubans and other Americans to and from the city, as it was feared that it would make communist infiltration much easier. Regardless, the passing of the act proved to be enormously beneficial for Guantanamo City, as people and their money began to pour in, further advancing the development of infrastructure and public services. In July of 1965, the situation in Mozambique took an unexpected turn. The communist movement was usurped by Uriah Simango, a minister and anti-communist nationalist. Far-left elements of the government were removed and purged, and the independence movement of Mozambique gradually shifted from one based on the principles of Marxist-Leninism to one of African nationalism, Christianity, and multi-party democracy. Due to this, American aid to the Portuguese government, reserved specifically to fight Frelimo, was redirected to fight the MPLA in Angola, leading to the disintegration of the movement by 1966. Though Mozambique was still fighting a war of independence, their steady territorial gains and victories against the Portuguese army, after American aid was cut off, made victory a matter of when rather than if. The rest of the decade passed by in relative silence. Without Vietnam, President Johnson focused entirely on domestic affairs and successfully lobbied for increased gun control, tax reform, infrastructure development, and the establishment of the National Park Foundation. As election time drew close, the Republicans and Democrats made their choices in nominee. The Republicans nominated Nelson Rockefeller, a New York moderate Republican who, while not the most liked among the American right, was seen as the most likely candidate able to win in a country that had been under Democratic control for nearly 40 years. The Democrats decided to go all the way with LBJ, who had a steady approval rating thanks to his social programs and civil rights successes. On Election Day, Lyndon Baines Johnson had secured his second term as President of the United States. The elections were unlike any the American public had ever seen. A moderate to liberal Republican from New York was the conservative candidate, and a segregationist third-party candidate, George Wallace, made significant gains in the ballots. Some analysts believe that LBJ's second term was only won because of the split vote among segregationist anti-liberals in the South and the divisiveness of Rockefeller's views.